And my name is Frank Onuh, and I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Leverage here in Canada. I'm so happy to lead this particular session and look forward to the engaging conversation we are going to be having all through. Just a little background. My first degree was in English linguistics at Manchester University. Then I did my master's at Manchester University before currently one of my career now. Although my research had massively kind of shifted from the traditional kind of research that is done in the departments of English to having more of social science components to it. So my doctoral research, for example, focuses on decolonizing information verification in Africa. But quantitative literary analysis and AI is what we're going to be focusing on today. And I have a new frontier in humanities research here, although the word new here is relatively not very true, right? But we could argue possibly that we have to return the word new there because of our own context and because of the newness of this application and this area, in the academic space in Nigeria, particularly in humanities, because many people in humanities don't see, never thought that there's a need for me to kind of understand what's happening in the AI sector. I need to understand, some statistics, basic statistics, that is required maybe in corpus linguistics that could provide both subjective or objective insights while analyzing any literary work. And so our discussion this morning or this afternoon, we focus around this. And at intermittent, I will stop and then maybe ask some questions. And then, as well, if you have a question you want to ask, I will prefer you could stop me at any time by maybe unmuting, or you could also just send a question on the chat. I've noticed, and it's a common thing, not just me, but, when you wait till the end of every class to ask people to, bring up their questions, some people might end up either forgetting it or deciding to just ignore it. So please, if you have your question, do not wait till the end of the session before you ask your question. All right. So I want you to see this as a classroom where we are teaching. And so do not wait till the end and ask your question. You could stop me at any time by unmuting once I see maybe someone trying to speak. I assume you're about to ask a question or make a comment, from what I'm already talking about. And so I'll allow you to go ahead to do that. Another thing, you can also send the question on the chat. However, because I might not be seeing the chat, the admin, once the admin sees that kind of question, then the admin could unmute and then call my attention, then I will stop, and we could have a conversation around that question and then continue our discussion. Okay, so we're looking at foundations of computational literary analysis, what quantitative method is in literary research, prompt engineering for literary exploration, and then we look at some very few case studies, and then we tell questions and answer. But again, remember I said that my question and answer is not waiting till the end of this, right? So this is just for ordering purposes. So but your questions will come at any point in time during this conversation. And so the overall goal will be to equip us, with better understanding of computational and AI-driven techniques, in literary analysis. Now, the aspect of AI-driven technique is kind of a little bit broad, but we're going to see how I capture that in our conversation today, because again, this is not a topic, that we could cover broadly or do justice to within just this few short period of time we have. So I thought to just, discuss and include things that I think, can stimulate our thinking. And if we want to further in different areas of this discussion, then we could have better footing to know, okay, this is what I should be doing or this is what I should be looking out for. And just a caveat, there are a lot of many resources as well. That I have in the slide, and many other ones I'm going to stay at eventually, which of course I will make available to the research ground team. and they will share those across to at the due time. Okay, so basically the objective will be, to help every one of us here to know how to synthesize computational method with traditional literary analysis and create, possibly novel interpretative frameworks, in their work, or possibly even see some insight that traditionally might not be possible to see. We're going to see those examples eventually later. You would see that there are some things that it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do traditionally without the aid of technology when you are doing literary analysis, literary work. See. And then, of course, we help you to evaluate the details and indication of where the approaches to literary studies are. Yeah. And so there are some core concepts. I'll begin with some core concepts that it is very important for you to understand some of these concepts when we are talking about literary analysis. And let me just let this target here. You might be wondering, but I'm not in this department, so I don't need to understand literary analysis, or why should I be listening to a session like this? All right. And so when it has to do with literary analysis, per se, as this topic is, one thing that is common among every single graduate students, there's a section in our graduate student thesis that we call literary. When you're writing a paper that is called literary. And the level of critical, criticality that is required for you to have a very strong critical review, is some of the skills you can also actually pick from this particular session as well. For example, you are writing your thesis and you have to read, let me just say, like 50 works, for instance. One of the challenges some students have is, so why writing my lecture review? How should I write it? And does it make sense if I group some authors who discuss similar things together? Should I, if a work does not relate to my work, but maybe there is this tangential relation, how do I integrate it? So the skill you gain from this will help in all those areas. And even beyond that, right? So one thing with academia is skill you get from a particular area or a particular discipline, depending on how open you are in your learning, could be transferable to virtually every other area. So stylometry, was credited pioneered by Thomas Mendenhall, and which was the term that kind of come into being in 1887, and he sought to kind of identify authorship through statistical measures of how words were used. And so even today, stylometry has remained relevant today, and not just in kind of, there's some people attribution studies, but also in helping to quantify voices, genre and discourse in literary corpora in general. And then we have what we're looking at today, quantitative analysis. That's not exactly the phrase that was used by George in 1935. However, by introduce what we now know as Zipf's law, which basically observed that word frequencies in language follow a power law distribution. Right, that word frequencies in language follow a power law distribution. And so basically it could be argued that George Z was kind of the first person that began to talk a lot about, what frequencies as you have in corpus linguistics now and in computational linguistics now, especially how it relates to, words and literary studies, even though he was not talking about literary studies, but the application, had been borrowed since that particular inception. And then, of course, in the 1950, you might have heard about the popular Turing test of 1950, where Turing proposed foundational ideas in natural language processing. And Turing's work, of course, imagine how machines could stimulate understanding, which is a goal we are still kind of grappling in the age of large language models today. If you're using ChatGPT, possibly the premium version, for instance, right? And so you see ChatGPT, when it's trying to give a response, it will say thinking or something like that, right? And the word thinking, of course, is trying to anthropomorphize ChatGPT as a humans are the ones that think. The machines think, so again, what do you define as thinking? What does thinking mean in this sense, right? If you say thinking, do you mean the process that humans engage in to produce a response? And does that process involve, the physical, neural connection that we know that's happened before those thinking happened? But of course, that machine in the literal sense do not think, right? But just the same way that humans take some time to meditate or think about something before they produce a response. So a machine is trying to gather those information, right? So they have attributed the word thinking to it. And that could be traced to Adam Turing's use of the word, or the question he asked, can machines really think, right? Can machines really think? And since then, that anthropomorphic assignment had been given to artificial intelligence in general. And then we have corpus linguistics, which is a very important term I believe by now some of you might have known, and it's a term that was arguably kind of developed by Charles Price in the 1952, and where he tried to formalize the practice of analyzing authentic language use through systematically collected corpora, and so basically during this period, Charles was anchors many forms of literary and linguistic analysis, and was trying to discuss the issue of frequency links to collocation and concordance tools, and many other things. Of course, during this particular period, there are no concordance tool per se, or Charles wasn't even talking about concordance tool, but Charles was very interested in how do we formalize the practice of analyzing real language, in a kind of a systematic way, where we could see a body of language and then see how we can analyze that language and see what is inside that language that normally we are not looking at because we think we use it, but we don't actually see what's within that language. And so that was attributed to corpus linguistic as a term per se, was attributed to Charles France. Of course, this is arguable as well. Some people say, no, he is not the first person to kind of, introduce this term. But the important thing was that it was during his time, or he was one that began to make this, term per se become quite very popular. And then, of course, we know AI, which is a very common term all of us know, which was formally introduced at a Dartmouth conference in 1952, where we have people like MacArthur, Minsky, Rochester, and Shannon. They tried to simulate human intelligence through computation. And this was actually what marked the disciplinary beginning of AI, as a formal field. Before this time, there had been a lot of things happening about AI, scattered around different parts of the world. But it was during this Dartmouth conference of 1956, that we can argue that AI as a field, artificial intelligence as a field, was formally, birthed during that particular conference. And then we have computational analysis, which is a term that is attributed, or the idea that is attributed to Joseph Rosenberg, who, of course, created Eliza, depends on how you want to, call the word, which is a rule-based conversational agent that mimics a psychotherapist. Of course, today we know that Eliza is kind of very primitive, but it kind of, show us I'm just showing us the history, how these whole things have started. It doesn't start in our generation. So there have been a lot of scholarly community historically who have been building on different people's knowledge, to get us to where we are today. And then another term you have to be familiar with is POS, or part of speech tagging. In 1971, the Brown University's what they call the Target Project introduced systematic part of speech tagging, which enabled machines to now be able to pass grammatical categories. And the importance of part of speech tagging is that it helps in what we call syntactic tagging and even name entity recognition. It helps a lot. I'm going to talk about that eventually later, about name entity recognition eventually later. And then we have the popular text mining, which was a term that was coined the idea of text mining in 1975. It was a term the idea that was formed by Gerard Salton and my peer. And basically text mining simply just means, when you extract meaningful information or meaningful patterns, from large unstructured text. So you have, terms that are very unstructured. For example, if you are doing maybe Python or many other some of these similar programming languages, you know that if you pick a novel, for example, like Things Fall Apart, which I'm going to talk later, so I give an example of Things Fall Apart eventually later. I took it as because I thought this is a kind of book that many of us know. So if you take Things Fall Apart, for example, and try to analyze it, a computer scientist will tell you that, hey, this is an unstructured data. This is an unstructured data. Why do they call it unstructured data? Because a structured data normally, has maybe tables, columns. You know that what is the gender? This is gender. What is the amount? These are the amounts. So in that way, if you're using, for example, SQL, you can easily, search for whatever thing you are looking for in each column and combine different columns. So, but when you don't have those kind of information, then the data you have is considered kind of structured data. And so when we are talking about text mining, basically is when we are starting with patterns from large unstructured data, large unstructured data. For example, you might want to text mine data from Twitter. Initially before, if you're an academic or you're affiliated with a university and you have university email address, you could apply to Twitter and say, hey, I need all the data, all the tweets that is done by Nigerians between January 1st, 2025 to January 1st, 2015, for instance, right? Sorry, January 1st, 2015, January 1st, 2025, for instance. And Twitter will make sure that you read all the agreement, make sure that you abide by you understand what their policies are. And then once you check all those marks, and then they will release the entire data to you. And that could be millions and billions of data points, right? So they have released the data to you. Now, but you actually didn't do text mining. Twitter were the one that did the text mining and just gave you the data. But when you now want to pick maybe some specific things from that huge amount of data that you have, there are particular information you're looking for. For example, you want to look for every single mention of, let me say, Buhari, for example, in connection to a particular thing, and you write your Python code, then you now begin to meaningfully extract, those kind of information again from the huge data that Twitter has already given you. So text mining is a very huge thing. So text mining sometimes is also kind of related to web scraping, which is basically when you write a code, for example, and you go to punchng.com and you want to scrap, all the news that is on their website to do a quick analysis, for example. Maybe you want to scrap all the news headlines that Punch newspaper have been giving for the last 5 years or for the past 4 years. So you write a code and scrap all those and then begin to do whatever kind of analysis depending on your intention. So text mining is a very huge thing. Now, the important thing about, or the beautiful thing about text mining or getting data from online, let me say from maybe say, for example, now you listen to a lot of YouTube, you watch YouTube videos, and you're interested in looking at the comments, for instance, for some reasons you want to analyze some things in YouTube comments and whatever, and you know that you cannot start copying the comments one after the other, especially maybe when the channel you are dealing with has about 20,000 comments in one single video. So how do you do that? You have a code to write. All right, you write a code that helps you scrap that particular. By the way, I have a code for that actually that helps you scrap every YouTube comments. If that's what you're interested in later, you can just message me, then I'll send you that particular script, and you'll see a demo of how to just run it within 2 minutes to scrap the entire comments on a YouTube video, for depending on what's your interest in. But that's kind of another example of how you text mine. Sometimes people try to relate web scraping to text mining. And then, of course, machine learning. So let's shift to machine learning driven development. Now, machine learning, in 1986, we have Rose Quinlan's ID tree algorithm maths, which marks a very strong breakthrough in machine learning by using what we call the strong tree to classify data. right? And this was an early step in transition from where we begin to transition from what we call rule-based to data-driven models of intelligence. So rule-based simply means the machine cannot do anything outside the rule that was agreed to it, right? But data-driven now is that the machine is beginning gradually to understand, if I see this data, I could likely act in this particular way. And so it was Quinlan's in what we call the ID tree upgrading that actually made a very huge breakthrough by using what we now know as Shem trees to classify data in the 1986. And then remember I mentioned name entity recognition, we have Lisa Liu, who in 1991, sorry, was credited for developing early methods, for name entity recognition. Now, basically, name entity recognition simply means, when you automatically or when the system automatically detects and classifies proper nouns. All right. Whenever I'm talking about name entity recognition, we are dealing with proper nouns. All right. And so the abbreviation normally NER as the first initial letters of the word, name entity recognition. And so basically it detects and classifies proper nouns. And this is very important, especially when you are trying to extract metadata from literary text. Maybe you are trying to identify who is the author, who the authors mentioned, what are the mentioned that the authors mentioned, what are the places, what are the institutions, within this particular massive popular. And is there any insight that this name, these places, these institutions, is there any insight that they could provide in the overall theme of that particular work? For example, if you notice that you read a particular piece of work and then the author mentioned, let me say, 50 names, 50 proper names, proper nouns, and those nouns, you notice that, let me say, 70% of them are name of women, and then, but the overall, theme of the work, is not doing with women empowerment and things like that, or women owning their voice or having agency or things like that. You begin to wonder, it could push you to start thinking, so why is it so? You cannot begin to do so. In what relation does those names actually appear? That despite their huge appearance in the text, it's not showing, it's not reflecting on the overall thematic presentation that the author is giving. And then we have sentiment analysis. Some of you might have must have heard about this term or even use it or even done research on it by now. And so in 2002, we have a man, someone known as Pobank and Lillian Lee, introducing this term we call sentiment analysis. And what they did was to use machine learning to detect opinion in a text. So to find out, what is the sentiment you are trying to pass in this particular text? Is your tone positive? Is your tone negative, or is your tone neutral? Right? And so it has been deployed. This is a very huge, area because it has been deployed even in commercial settings and not just literary study again. So you are buying something online, for instance, and you make an order. All the reviews that people write on any product, for example, they subject them to sentiment analysis. How many reviews have a positive tone? How many reviews have a negative tone? And how many reviews, are neutral? As a matter of fact, when you check those review ratings, those stars, 5-star, 3-star, 4-star, the assigning of those stars is dependent on sentiment analysis automatically. So the more, if you write and then your comment shows that this is negative, nothing is actually assigned. This is positive, then the star is taken. And so depending on the number of people whose sentiment or opinion, geared towards the positive side, will determine whether that product will have a 5-star, depending on the rating, or 10-star, whichever ending they choose to put. So that is how sentiment analysis work. For example, you see what I did initially, that you have something going on in Nigeria now, the state of emergency in River State. And so I have an example I'll show us later where I brought the presidential speech that Tinubu made, to pronounce that state of emergency, and then compared it with the one that Goodluck Jonathan made in 2011, when he also, declared state of emergency. And we're going to see the two of them and see what is in one and what is not in one, and just see the language and things that we're using in both, and the kind of tones, that we could see in both. Now, if you if you are asked to analyze the sentiments of both speech just by listening to them, you might not be able to give a strong correct response. But by the time you now sit down and say, wait, I want to do a sentiment analysis, and this could actually be a paper anybody could actually pick up and write, by the way, and work on, the sentiment of Nigerian presidential emergency declaration, comparing Goodluck Jonathan and, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, and you look at both of them and see what is happening in both of them and the level of sentiment that each of them is using, which one is generic, which one is more individualistic, who is making reference to himself more, and who's making reference to people more, and other things like that. And then we have topic modeling. So, well, topic modeling is arguably, again, I do arguably formalized by David Blake, Andrew and Michael Jordan it's not a Michael Jordan that plays basketball, by the way. Michael Jordan in 2003, here what they call the latent directional allocation, LDA. And basically what they did was to enable the probabilistic detection of themes in large text sets, right? So if you are trying to detect, for example, you have, again, you pick all of Wole Soyinka's work, for example, right? Or if you even pick all your social media posts, for example, you can do a topic modeling. By the way, you can get all your posts on Facebook, right? If you do a topic modeling of your post on Facebook to see what you have actually been talking about on Facebook, you started Facebooking, right? And then you copy all those things and then you run them, and then what you're trying to do is to detect what are the themes in this large text. Of course, it depends on if you are not very active on Facebook and another time that maybe post often, you basically just write comments, view, and things like that. Then you won't really see a huge insight. But if you give maybe somebody, if you are someone that types posts frequently, and then you gather that data that you have been using for almost 5 to 10 years on Facebook, and then you run topic modeling, you might be surprised, with the themes that are going to emerge. That's why in technology, or it's generally said that, technology actually knows you more than you actually know yourself. Because when you interact with this system for 10 years, the system knows what's the kind of person you are, the kind of things you like, and the kind of things you do not like. And this is where what we call recommendation system comes in. So the algorithm begins to recommend things to you, based on the things you liked, because the algorithm has seen what you have been doing for the past 5 years, and then created behind the scene without your knowledge, without your consent, design, topic model what you have been doing for those past period of time, and then begin to give you, thing. And so sometimes you wonder, how do they know that I'm looking for this? It's not magic, actually, right? The system has already understood the kind of conversation you've been having, and what you've been posting, what you've been liking, and what you've been disliking. And so the recommendations are based on those ideas. And then in the year 2000, we have Franco Moretti, proposing what we call distant reading, which is basically a methodology that emphasizes abstraction and pattern recognition across massive corpora. And this is in contrast to close reading, which have been dominant, for years. And people use close reading when you are dealing with canonical texts. Use close reading when you're dealing with canonical texts. For example, if you're a Christian or a Muslim, for you to be able to understand the Bible or the Quran, very, very, very well, you might be required to engage in close reading. All right, you might be required to engage in close reading. Basically, you see a sentence, for example, and you don't just read the sentence and leave. You begin to ask yourself, so why was this word used in this sentence? Why wasn't this word used? Why did they put this punctuation? Why didn't they put this punctuation? And why am I seeing this kind of phrase, this particular kind of syntax, consistently in a particular kind of incident, for example. For example, in Bible, maybe you want to look at the appearance of in thy name and see how does the phrase in thy name, in what context does it appear in the entire Bible, for example. And so you are beginning to engage in close reading to understand what's happening. So what Franco Moretti said, now we are going to be dealing with distant reading, and this is applicable, this is important because when you have millions of data to deal with, Like I gave you an example before, when Twitter gives you access to millions of data. Of course, you can't get access to Twitter data now since Elon Musk took over. He kind of stopped that access. You have to pay right now for you to get, and that's a huge amount of money. I remember making a request, and it will cost. If they wanted to charge me almost 15,000 to 20,000 USD, to get a data set point for about 15 years to do some analysis. So it's crazy. It's not something you can even think about right now. But if you are dealing with that kind of data set, for example, it is impossible, practically impossible for you to do close reading for that huge amount of data set, right? So what you will do is what Franco Moretti proposed, which is distance reading, which basically is saying you are dealing with this huge amount of data and you are looking for patterns in this data. And there's no way you could do close reading, so we have to use what they call distance reading, which actually provoked a very major methodological shift in literary studies, and created space for what has become known as data-driven criticism. So literary scholars might begin to use data, to do their criticism and other things like that. And then we have deep learning, in which Geoffrey Hinton in 2012, was attributed for developing or pushing the idea of deep learning via neural networks. And of course, we know that neural networks outperform traditional models in image and speech recognition and what have you. Then we have tokenization. I have just one more, then I'll move to other section. Then we have tokenization. So of course, we know that Google's WordPress algorithm was released in 2016. And that was when they introduced a new tokenization method for breaking language into subunits. And this has actually massively enhanced, the performance of multilingual models and set the standard for transformer-based architecture, which eventually we had during the GPT and many other language models are currently using that. Of course, the launch of ChatGPT, OpenAI GPT in 2018, was what marked, the very obvious rise of large language models. We also have what we call small language models, by the way, but that's not the focus for today as well. So, but the difference between both of them, this one is large, this one is small. So you could do the specialized, model that focus, let me say, on Yoruba intonation and things like that. So we also have small language models. And small language models tend to have very higher level of precision because of the amount of data they were built to it. And of course, depending also on how the team were able to, deal with all the adjacencies that are in the entire program. And so, so the LLM was popularly, pronounced or announced by the launch of GPT in 2018 by OpenAI. And these massive transformers models, of course, they were trained on billions of words, billions and billions and billions of words. And of course, now you know that ChatGPT, for example, can generate text, it can simulate dialogue, things that initially take huge amount of time, for example, to do. For instance, if you're in business school or you're a business-oriented person, you're doing a business-related course, for instance, you know that to simulate a scenario sometimes take months, but now within 10 minutes, for example, depending on how good your prompting is, ChatGPT or DeepSeek or Perplexity or Gemini or Cloudy, the chatbot could simulate a very strong, scenario for you that you could now just modify within a few minutes and then go ahead and do the most important thing you want to do that the system might not be able to do. And so textual quantification. Now, I'll read this.
Hey boss, charge your phone.
I'll read this very quickly. So for well over a century, academic disciplines have studied human behavior using quantitative information. Until recently, however, the humanities have remained largely immune to the use of data or vigorously resisted it. Thanks to new developments in computer science and natural language processing, literary scholars have embraced the quantitative study of literary works and have helped make digital humanities a rapidly growing field. But these developments raise a fundamental and as yet unanswered question. And what's that question? What is the meaning of literary quantity? And so this particular paragraph I read now was, was a paragraph that the University Press of Chicago wrote as kind of a short review, about this particular book, Enumeration by Andrew, Enumeration Data and Literary Study by Andrew. Very interesting book to actually look at. So in other words, if you now look at this, paying attention to quantity reveals the groups and channels of cultural expression, the deep connections among words, ideas, and forms. That's in the tree. That's what Andrew said, that if you pay attention to numbers, to quantity in literary work, it reveals the groups and channels of cultural expression and the deep connections among words, ideas, and form. If you don't pay attention to them, you might not see those meanings. They'll actually be looking at you, but you'll not see them because you're not looking for them. And of course, literary quantity refers to immeasurable textual features like repetition, scale, and distribution that structure meaning across text and time. So in other words, literary quantity refers to measurable textual features like repetition, textual feature like repetition, scale, and distribution that structure meaning across text and time. So whenever we're saying, hey, we are doing literary quantitative analysis, of course, it doesn't mean when you write a paper, you always have to write literary quantitative analysis. No, from your title, people can actually know, for example, what you are doing, that you are actually definitely including, quantitative analysis in the work you are doing. And later, I'm going to see how is it possible to do quantitative analysis with a literary work. How does that work? How is that possible? We're going to see that later. But again, I brought this at a very peripheral level. And then I won't spend much time here, but before I move on to this place, I would like to ask if anyone has a question now. Do anyone have a question now? Somebody saying you can't hear anything. Can somebody hear me? I need to be sure that I can be heard.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, but just a moment. Just for me, the volume is a bit low.
Yes,
Oh,
we
okay.
can-
So
we
give me
can
a
hear you.
moment.
We can
Okay.
hear you.
Okay, somebody said the volume is a bit low. So just give me a second. Let me just put earpiece. Then that should be very, very fine. Then give me a second. Is the sound better now? Is the sound better now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. All right. Okay. So okay. So let's go on. So I didn't see any question, so I can continue since I didn't see any question. Can go ahead since I didn't see any question. Okay. So what is AI? This is a very common one. I already mentioned what AI is, but it's part of the ordering of my slide. But basically, in the simplest way, AI refers to the capacity of machines to perform tasks, that would typically require human intelligence, right? And this will include a lot of things like pattern recognition, decision making, language understanding, which is natural language processing, and adaptive learning, and many other things. But beyond these functional definitions, right, AI also raises very deeper philosophical and socio-technical questions about autonomy, consciousness, which I already mentioned, control, and even the boundaries, of cognition itself. Generally, AI is classified into two main types. Generally, we have the what we call the weak AI, which is also called the narrow AI, which refers to the system that you design to perform specific tasks, such as translation or image recognition. Let me give you an example. ChatGPT, for example, is
pride itself for doing everything at the same time, and that is why it might not be good at doing everything at the same time, right? Because you can generate image in ChatGPT, you can generate text in ChatGPT, but if you go to Adobe Firefly, which is one of their premium packages for image generation, or you go to many other image generation tools like Audiogram and the rest of them, you will notice that if you put the same prompt you give ChatGPT to those systems, for example, the quality, the image they generate is massively stronger. The quality is stronger. Image captures better what you are looking for, and they even give you alternatives, different versions of the same image. Now, the reason is because the model was purely focused on generating image. What ChatGPT is used on generating image, generating code, generating text, and all kinds of things. And so the more you broaden the work or the capacity or the product that your model could produce, the lesser accuracy the model will begin to release based on what people are asking the model. So of course, strong AI is what we call AGI, or artificial general intelligence, which basically refers to machines being capable of understanding, reasoning, and learning across different domains at the same time, which is equivalent or could even surpass human intelligence. Now, there's some people are arguing, is it possible for us to achieve AGI? Some people say yes, some people say no. Well, there's nothing that's not possible to achieve, but what I've understood with human being is that whatever state we get to, we are so adaptive to know how to beat and continue just surviving and living. In 1986 or 87, then about calculator, for example, was launched or was announced. I remember, reading how high school, elementary school teachers in the US, we are protesting that students should not be allowed to use calculator, that it will kill critical thinking, they're no longer going to think again, and things like that. But that's not true, right? I can't remember, I don't know how many people are using calculator today, but say, except maybe you are going to take your math class and things like that. You can calculate on your phone, on laptop, and everywhere. But initially, it was not like that. They tried to stop it, right? So there's always there's always this skeptical view that people have about new development. It's genuine because people sometimes losing job are scared of a lot of things. And so because of that scare and fear, they try to oppose that particular development or that particular. I don't want to use the word growth because again, growth is a subjective word that could mean different things to different, demographics. And so very quickly, evolution of AI. Now I've talked about this. I'm not going to push more about what Alan Turing did in 1950s again, but the intellectual root of AI can be traced back to Alan Turing, all right, who is 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, was able to pose what the question we now know as can machines think, and so Turing was not really trying to define thinking directly per se, but what we're trying to do was to introduce what later became known as the Turing test, which is actually a practical method that we use to assess machine intelligence based on imitation. All right, and this was formally, like I said, the period that marked the beginning of formal discourse on machine recognition and symbolic computation. And then by 1960s and 70s, you have a question? Does anyone have a question? Oh, okay. So in 1960s and 70s, we have the early growth and challenges. So the 60s and 70s saw what we call both the enthusiasm and the stagnation. There was AI boom, there was what we call AI winter, and a lot of things happened during that particular time. Funding were reduced, people were not seeing the expected results. IBM, which was one of the biggest funders of AI then, were withdrawing funding. So a lot of things were happening. So there was both the booming and there was both the challenges happening simultaneously at the same time. And then by the 2000, of course, we now came to an era where we have data-driven AI rising massively. And so begin to have machine learning, which of course there are two developments that actually enable this transformation. Number one was the exponential growth in data, which kind of increases computational power, especially when it has to do with GPUs and algorithmic advances, such as backpropagation in neutral network. And they'll have AI systems also beginning to learn from data instead of relying on explicit programmed rules. So it was in 2000 that AI now began to learn, okay, so if I have this data about A, about B, about C, and they talk with me for 5 or 4 days, I could begin to make inference about things about them. And so it was in this period that this actually began to happen. And this is where we now have the era of, Google, Amazon, and Facebook begin to use all kinds of, recommendations and all kinds of things to, get people very much engaged in the social media space. And of course, digital surveillance and consumption began to massively, intensify. And of course, in 2010, we have another major AI boom, which is driven by deep learning and neural architecture, such as convolutional and recurrent neural networks. Then finally, by sorry, then finally by 2020s, we have the ChatGPT launch, which was a major game changer in all these discussions. Now, what is the foundation of computational literary analysis? What is the foundation? Now, I won't spend much time here because I want to really go to the practical part where we're going to see those applications I mentioned initially so that we could see how this actually really works. But what are the foundations studies? Because it's important for us to have this historical understanding of how these have evolved. I mentioned Thomas Mendel already, who is widely credited with pioneering stylometry, which is a quantitative study of literary style through the analysis of word frequencies, And although we could say that his work was limited by the tools of his time, but he laid his foundation for statistical authorship studies. What we can apply tools like, let me say, AntConc or Python-based NLP tools to conduct stylometry analysis. I've mentioned this already. But Robert Busa is a very important one to mention because in 1949, Robert Busa is an Italian Jesuit priest, of course, who collaborated with IBM to digitize the works of Thomas Aquinas. And so in the field of digital humanities, he's kind of referred to as the father, or the founder of digital humanities per se, because he is the first person to have seen done that kind of work. And that was the very first substantial application of digital technology to the humanities. And like I said, which is often cited as the birth of the field of what we now know as digital humanities, which I will talk a little bit later during this conversation. And then by 1951, we have Joseph Myers, creating a computer-assisted concordance of English poetry, Berkeley in the US, and her work is actually one of the earliest examples of digital text analysis, where actually she highlights the gendered, neglect in historical narrative of computational research. And so you could see that what we are doing now is something that people have been working on this before, but each generation begin to elevate their analysis and what they are looking for and continue to make the system entirely better. And of course, Frederick Mosler and David Wallace, applied what is known as the Bayesian statistics to solve the problem of authorial attribution in the disputed Federalist Papers. And basically in their work, what they did was to demonstrate that statistical models could actually resolve long-standing literary and historical questions with very clear empirical precision. And then we have the Association for Literary and Linguistics in Computing, which is an organization that promoted the systematic development of computational approaches in language and literature. And they also help to kind of institutionalize what had been isolated effort of different people. So what had been happening before this association was founded was that different people were just doing research, and some people don't even know that what they were doing was quantitative literary analysis. Some people didn't even know that they were doing computational literary analysis. And so by the time this organization was founded in 1973, people were able to now come together and know, oh, it's actually what we are doing. So it helps to unify, institutionalize those individual isolated efforts that people have been doing, engaging in all these years. I've mentioned Franco Moretti, so I'm going to ignore that right now. But the last one I want to mention is Stanford Library Lab. which was established or founded in 2010. And so this lab became, a major hub for collaborative computational criticism, producing even landmark papers on genre, plot, character networks, where they are using different massive literary data sets. And so these are some of how, this movement have grown. And you will notice something here. You will notice that there is no mention, for example, of the development of this in Africa. And of course, you understand with me that technology in general, particularly in this particular space, is a more recent thing. The application of tech in literary analysis is kind of a more recent thing, in our context. And the reason could be very simple. The traditional humanities scholars or practitioners or practice, we are so isolated from the computer science or from the in quote technical disciplines that other scholars are in. So you see scholars operating in isolation. So somebody in literary studies just focuses on literary studies, but there is no collaboration with somebody in computer science. But now you could be in history, for example, and you are doing quantitative history, for instance, and so you don't know how to code at all, but you collaborate with somebody in computer science who knows how to code. So you bring the humanities perspective of history, and then plus the little quantitative understanding you have, and then you work with that particular person and produce some very huge, insightful, quantitative insight from the data you are working with. Now, so we have, I will cite just two major early computational initiatives we have in African literary studies, where unfortunately these two initiatives, even though they were focused on Africa, the people that worked on these initiatives, did so in the US, all right? They did so in the US, precisely in Princeton, where they have this computational approaches to Nigerian literature. You could see in the screen experiments in NLP for text Yoruba, and Efi. And so this was a project that was led by Happy Buzaba, Otitufon Iyang, and Temitayo Olatoye. So who were students, doctoral students at Princeton that time. And so they led this particular project. And then the project has three major goals. Number one was to test multilingual language models on African language literature. They wanted to see, the multilingual language model that they have during this particular time, 2020. The project lasted for 3 years, 2020, 2023. And of course, this was the initial inception of, LLMs. And so a lot of things were still very messy. But they were trying to test and see to what extent does the multilingual language models, work with African language. And by African language here, they were basically focusing on the Yoruba language and then the Efik language. And of course, you could understand the rationale for those two languages, right? One of the researchers is Temitayo Olatoye, so he or she chose Yoruba, and the other researcher is Otutofon Iyang, and who is from those languages, Efik, right? So they were also paying what we call epistemic homage to their culture to see how they can push in their language into the entire domain of machine learning. And then another thing that they all did was to build an associated corpus of foundational work like Daniel Fagowan's novels. If you know Daniel Fagowan very well, or if you read about him or heard about him, he's one of the founders of literary writing in the Yoruba literary space. So he has a lot of novels, a lot of works he wrote in Yoruba. And so those works were the focus, was for example, Temitayo used, to see to what extent, does these models understand what this Yoruba language is. And then finally, they were able to compare the original text with English translation to assess the representational, fidelity of those texts. And then the next one is African Universal Dependency Tree Bank project. Again, this is also done by exactly the same school, by Princeton, and this project actually built on digital infrastructure efforts. The previous project I'm talking about built on this particular one actually, and their focus is basically to see the morphological incomplexity of agglutinative languages. So Yoruba, Efik, and many other, there are a lot of African languages, even Zulu, that are referred to as agglutinative languages. And why are they called agglutinative languages? Simply because many of those languages strongly, to an extent, resist simple tokenization, unlike English language. And so that's why they were actually called, agglutinative languages. And then the languages also lack kind of standardized orthography to some extent. So you could see that even within the same speaking, the same community, there are different orthographic representation of the same word, even the tonal frequency or tonal release of the same word. There are a lot of differences in them. And then, of course, there's a limited digital corpora for training large language models, as we all know by this time. So what are the persistent challenges? There is a huge linguistic resource gaps, all right? So for example, out of 2,000 African languages, only 11 African languages as of this time, 2021 and 23, actually have structured NLP data sets, which of course, you know that if you don't have huge amount of NLP data set, then the model diversity will be very, very minimal. And so the frequency or the ability of the model to actually produce better response will be very, very minimal. I don't know how many of you are following up the news, but there's this young man in University of Lagos, who developed Yan GPT. All right, and Yan GPT is a GPT, is an AI model, that could mimic Yoruba, Igbo, Hassan, and some other languages with almost near perfect accents, right? Almost near perfect accents. He's a mechanical engineer student who is in his final year currently. Almost perfect accent. And so you could see. So now what he did was to create a small language model, build a language model to be able to, help produce some Nigerian languages when you give them the English version, it can produce Nigerian language. Or when you give them the Yoruba version, the text, it can speak and produce Nigerian languages in a near perfect accent of it. Again, accent is a difficult issue here because, again, you know that in Yoruba, there are different accents even in Yoruba. Somebody who is in Ibadan, for example, and somebody who is in Ekiti, perhaps might have different accents. In Igbo land, it's the same thing. Enugu, Anambra, Ebonyi, they have entirely different accents. And so these are also challenges. How do we accommodate all these accents, right, into this particular model? You notice that if you are chatting with AI, they have British accent, American accent, and some other kind of accent. But those accents are very minimal because they are just like 3, 4, or 5. But ours, we have a lot of them even within a particular ethnic community. And then we have digital preservation issues as well. But again, in as much as I advocate for data preservation, I understand that it's not everything that you need to put on the digital space. There are some sacred items that are required to stay where they are that you don't actually need to push on the digital space. Another reason for that is whatever I put on the digital space, are you the owner of that digital realm? Because digital space, while it allows people to have access to data, also allow or give opportunity for data commodification as well. So where somebody can just take your data and be making money out of your data, and then you think that you're actually preserving data online, not knowing that you're actually enriching a particular capitalist enterprise. They will have platform dependencies. So this is very important because much of the infrastructure that we use in this space are hosted on the Western-owned platform, which again raise issues of data sovereignty. Who owns this data? Because if the platform decides to collapse, it means that everything you have there is gone. So who owns those platforms, right? And that's what is, as we're having this conversation, I want some of us who possibly are in computer science and other more technical areas to begin to think about how do we actually own our own platform. China owns their own platform, for example. So that is why the US cannot do anything basically to them, right? They own their own system. They determine what they want to do, determine what they get out for people to see. So if you don't own the platform, then your power is massively limited. And so this is one of the major challenges we're having in this space. And then there are a lot of methodological tension. We have computational analysis, which often privilege objectivity, right? But we know that African literature demands engagement with postcolonial subjectivity. So when you're dealing with African context, for example, there's a lot of issue that you have to engage with subjectivity and not objectivity, right? And so you have to navigate these methodological tensions while you are dealing with this. And then finally, disciplinary dissonance. All right. So this simply basically means, People who are in history do not see any reason why they should work with somebody who is in computer science. Somebody who is in computer science does see people who are doing history as these guys are not serious, right? And that is why we see people in the West, they produce very strong quality, discourse or very strong quality academic material. The reason is because they work collaboratively. So somebody in humanities or in social sciences thought of a particular thing and says that, but this thing could have an element of this aspect, but I don't have the expertise in this, and so they have to work together. But what happens is that when we work in silos, and developing this skill is very important right now from the graduate studies program, you begin to think, how does my work, for example, incorporate an interdisciplinary component in it? And that would now allow you to begin to broaden your view. So you are studying history, for example, but we have people whose specialty in history, the history of technology, for instance, right? The person in the history department, but his specialty is the history of technology. And so you'll be wondering, when this person is speaking or when this person is finished graduating from the university, for example, the person is open to being accepted in many other spheres of areas because of where he has chosen to specialize. He decided that though I'm in history, but I want to make sure that my work is multidisciplinary and by diverting into different areas. And so that's what happened. But when people work or program or project is kind of very, very siloed, it becomes difficult for collaboration to happen. And what happens is that when the time arises for possible even job placement or position, they kind of find themselves fixed into that particular narrow space. And so when people try to get them in, it's difficult because they're like, we know that this skill is transferable, but you are actually so much fixed in this particular area. Somebody in history, for example, can focus on his history might be on someone can be in history and be discussing public health, right? And all the person is doing is tracing the historical evolution of public health in Africa, for example. Now, the person is in history, but is already having interaction with people in the medical area, for example. So what happens is that the person will eventually become a very much stronger, permit me to say, knowledge and make stronger contribution to the community, and even have better placement, possibly, in the future. And so these are things you begin to think about right now, especially if you are maybe at the initial stage of writing your thesis or your thesis has not been approved. You should ask yourself, how do I incorporate an interdisciplinary perspective or component to my work such that it could have a very much stronger impact. Again, these are something that AI could help do very much easily this time. You have your ideas already, and then AI could suggest different interdisciplinary components, and you can now look and decide, okay, which one do I think is better, and things like that. And then finally, on this section, so these challenges we are beginning to address them gradually, all the challenges I mentioned initially. And so we have very few DH centers in Africa, to my knowledge. I mean, and by DH centers, I mean the ones that are fully functional, that are recognized, even by the Global Association of Digital Humanities globally. We have the Center for Digital Humanities at the University of Lagos. And the reason why I'm mentioning this center, so that if you want to associate with them, you can easily associate with them and begin to increase your capacity in this whole area that we are discussing now. I'm privileged to be one of the facilitators and mentors in the Center for Digital Humanities in Lagos, which is led by Professor Tunde Davis of the University of Lagos. As a matter of fact, we joined Professor Tunde to push for NUC, Nigerian University Commission, to make digital humanities mandatory in all the Nigerian universities. And if you check now, NUC has made digital humanities mandatory in all the Nigerian universities. And that is so important. But you see, what I noticed that's happening now is that some universities, instead of them to work toward developing a full program in digital humanities, all they are now trying to do is to just teach one or two courses in digital humanities, and then that's it. But that's not the purpose, that's not the aim of NUC. The aim is that every university should have a fully functional digital humanities center, because this is where somebody who is in English, in history, in computer science, and many, they could come together and begin to collaborate. And people who in humanities who traditionally do not use technology in their research, we begin to see different tools that they could use in their research. And that's when they begin to now see that, wow, so I never knew that I could use this. I never knew that I could do this. And when you know how to use those tools, like I said, you are opening massive doors for yourself in many different areas. So even if you choose to leave the academia, for example, that's not the path you want to eventually follow or pursue, you still have a lot of options to fall back to at the end, right? And then we have the South African Center for Digital Language Resources, which is called SADILA, very popular center in South Africa. In fact, it's actually been working before the Center for Digital Humanities at the University of Lagos. And then we have the Center for Humanitarian Research at the University of Western Cape Town. And the interesting thing is that if you email, one thing I can tell you for free is University of Lagos Center for Digital Humanity, for example, we just finished a summer school now, right? Now, if you email and say you want to attend the summer school, sometimes it's very competitive sometimes, but some students are provided full funding to attend the summer school for the full 1 week. So the accommodation, the transport, and everything is catered for. The same thing with many of these programs in South Africa and Western Cape Town. They also sponsor some of those their summer schools. So you could also apply, be checking their website and know when are these things coming out, and then you could apply for them and see that how it goes. If you go for a summer school for 1 week, it could stimulate it could actually change your entire career trajectory, from that particular period. It was in the summer school at Unilag that I met my current supervisor at the University of Lethbridge, where I am currently. After I saw their presentation, I said, these guys are talking similar things I'm trying to look at. And of course, I contacted them. I said, hey, do you mind? Do you have opportunity for supervision in your program? I think blah, 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 blah. So there are a lot of opportunities that could actually leverage by being part of these centers. And you don't need to pay any money to be part of them right away. Just reach out to them and introduce yourself. I mentioned this already. So I will stop again now to take a question. If you have a question. What about AI's lack of determinism? Okay, Naifa asks, what about AI's lack of determinism? Naifa, I'm struggling to kind of understand the question. Is it possible for you to unmute? Nufaisa, is it possible? Is it possible for you to unmute?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm here. Okay, what I'm trying to ask her is, sometimes you could put a certain prompt like on ChatGPT asking a specific question, but when you try to, after a while, when you try to input the same question, it might not really give you the same answer. You understand? So could that be a challenge? It might give you a similar answer, but not at exactly what it gave you some minutes ago. That's what I'm trying to ask.
Okay. So now, if you know how, number one thing is that AI models do not have I'm trying to be technically careful in my words now, but they don't store memory per se, not store memory per se. And the reason why it's called large language model is because you could ask it one question 1,000 times and it could give you different responses 1,000 times. Right? To give you different responses 1,000 times. Okay. And as a matter of fact, what I tell people, I'm going to talk about prompting eventually later. Maybe that time I'll answer your question in a very much broader sense. But you're already pushing me towards that. But if you ask AI something, and then you're expecting to give you the same response again, it's not possible. It cannot give you the same response. In fact, even when you ask it, now if you ask it, repeat the response you just gave me previously, that's the only time you can do that. But if you ask the same question again in an entirely new different page, it goes and provides something entirely different because it works with what we call perplexity. But I'll discuss that eventually later so that you have a better understanding of that. And this is why also AI has what they call hallucination, which I don't like using. It's only human beings that can hallucinate. But again, we're trying to make AI look as if it's human. So where it speaks as though it's very correct, very fluent, and yet it's speaking just bullshit, not making any single sense. But it arranges all the words in order everything makes very good sense, but it doesn't actually make any sense if you look at it very much closely, very much closely. Okay,
Okay,
so
thank you, sir. Yes.
all right, thank you. So what does quantity in literary analysis mean? What value does quantification add to our interaction with an interpretation of literary material or text? Anyone respond? In your own understanding, what does quantity in literary analysis mean? Anyone? Okay, so this is a question you have to think about, right? Because you need to understand what that means for you to be able to go ahead with doing that. This is something you have to think about. Then I have some readings, so of course, I'll share quite a lot more readings with us later. Now, I'll be going very much quickly now. Now, in corpus linguistics, is a scientific method of language analysis. Requires the analysis to provide empirical evidence in the form of data drawn from language corpora in support of any statements made about language. That was Brezina in page 2. And so what is corpus linguistic? Corpus simply means a body of text. A body of text. Corpora means a body of text. Right? And so before personal computers and before graphical interfaces and long before the internet, computing was very, very mechanical, very, very, very mechanical. We have what we call punch card. So you could see that thing like a cardboard at the top with numbers on it. We call it punch card. And they will have the mainframes. Mainframe. Now, this was used in 20th centuries. And you know what you do? Now, you get a punch card, which is also known as Hollerith card. And it was a stiff paper. It's stiff paper that is used to store data by punching holes. So when you are punching holes into the punch card, you are actually storing data in it. And so each row, please, can you mute if you are not talking? And so each row represents one line of data, and each column represents a character or an instruction. For example, a single and typical card, for example, could hold about, let me say, 80 columns. And each column could encode, let me say, one character. And so this was how they used to store information in those days. But of course, I know none of us, in fact, I'm not even seeing this machine apart from seeing it online, right? And so corpus linguistics is a quantitative methodology that typically works with numbers, which reflect the frequency of words and phrases in corpora. And that was what Macri did. Now I'm going to go straight into where our analysis is going to actually begin. But before I begin the analysis here, I will explain like 4 key important words that we need to understand. If you don't understand these key words or these important words, you might struggle understand what I'm about to explain now. And that's why I have to bring them back again. Now, how about the called stylometric analysis? Now, which actually identify authorial fingerprints. You want to identify what are the fingerprints of an author through statistic pattern of word frequencies, sentence structures, and distinctive collocations. Collocation simply means how words are naturally co-occur with the other in an expression. Then we have keyword studies. Keyword studies actually just compare literary texts against a reference corpus to reveal statistically significant lexical items that characterize an author or a genre. Okay, and then we have collocational analysis. In collocational analysis, what you're basically doing is you are trying to examine how do words combine and create meaningful networks. And what does this meaningful network reveal about that particular word or about that particular text? Then we also have what we call diachronic corpus studies. You have what we call diachronic and synchronic. But diachronic basically tracks linguistic evolution within literary traditions. So in diachronic study, for example, you could be mapping how lexical choices and grammatical patterns shift over time. For instance, somebody could be checking, how do people, when people mention, for example, when people mention, this might look very minute, but these are kind of that people even sometimes people look at. That's very funny sometimes. When people mention the word, let me say Nigeria, for example, somebody can look at to find out what adjectives have been used to qualify Nigeria for the past 40 years, for instance. And how has that changed? Right. So has it been negative adjective, absolute adjective, positive adjective, and how has that changed over time? So these are something that from people who are interested in diachronic purpose studies looking at actually. And then we have, of course, the purpose pragmatics, which basically explores how contextual features and implied meanings operate systematically across literary texts. Now, I'm going to look at things fall apart. I believe many of us here, if you have not read things fall apart, you may have heard about things fall apart. Now, what I did was that I picked things fall apart, and every of the insights I'll be sharing with you here, we are created with a prompt I gave, in an AI, in ChatGPT and other AIs. Now, when I first of all, I took things fall apart as a book. I have the PDF, and then I uploaded it on the system, and then I tell ChatGPT, of course, I'm using our lab. We have the ChatGPT premium. We subscribe it as a lab. Our lab strive for that because we do a lot of work with AI. So I asked ChatGPT, I need you to just store this particular novel and just keep it here. I'm going to tell you what to do next. And so by the time I'm done, what I wanted to do was to look at some things that are happening within the book, right? That are normally you can never ever be able to pick them out if you are trying to use your normal natural eye to get them. For example, if I ask you, what is how many times does the word mother, for instance, appear in ChatGPT in Tino Atebe's Things Fall Apart? You will not know, right? Because it's not something you have to consider. How many times did father appear? You will not know how many times the children appear. Now, but this is very important. I'm going to show how this is very important. Now we're dealing with quantitative literary analysis. Now, why this is important is now you're beginning to wonder, so why did mother appear? Mother appeared 132 times in the entire novel, for example. And you can click on the word mother. By the way, the tool I use as well in line with ChatGPT for this analysis to get this number of words, it's not ChatGPT. I use a software called Antpunk. Maybe on my time, I'm going to share with us later. It's a free software. So when I run the novel in Antpunk, and then Antpunk gave me the frequency of words. And so I saw that mother is 132. Now, if I click on the word mother, it's going to take me to another page within the software where I'm going to see all the context, where mother was used. I think I see a hand raised. Research round. I see a hand raised.
Good evening, Mr. Frank. I wanted to let the participants know that they can engage the quiz. Please engage the poll.
Okay. Thank you.
So, all right.
Okay, guys, a survey. I think you're talking about the survey, right? Yeah, there's a survey. I saw that survey pop up. Please make sure you engage with that survey, please. Make sure you engage with that survey. And so, do you see what I'm talking about now? So you see that mother is 132 words. And so your interest could just be that you want to see how does Ichebe or Things Fall Apart represent motherhood or represent mother in the entire work. And so by looking at the entire context where that mother occurred, you could actually see that, oh, okay, so this is how mother was used or referenced this particular work. But my interest here is, first of all, I wanted to look at the familiar communal lexical network. I want to see how does the relationship between family and communal networks, how do they relate in the entire Things Fall Apart? So I'm going to just put this in first before I explain. Okay, so if you look at the first, you see that there are family terms. We have mother, father, children, which total occurrence is 333. But we have community terms. We have clan, we have people, we have village, we have men, we have women, and you see the number of total occurrence. And then we have collective pronouns. We have they, them, we, or, and their total number of occurrence as well. Now, what is this even significant at all? Why is it even significant at all? Now, what I did was, first of all, remember I said, first of all, got to know these numbers from the Antpunk software. And then you could pull out, you could copy everything about, so let me put a highlighter here so that, yeah. So you could copy everything from the software about, about mother and the entire context about mother. For example, And then you could put that entire, context, that entire context in ChatGPT, for instance. And then depending again on what you are looking for, right? And then ChatGPT say, for example, how does Chinua Achebe, represent mothers? Could say, can you give me that response? Let me say in 7 or 10 or 5 or 3 major thematic summary. How does he represent mothers? And could you also give me examples, for instance? And then if you want to do some quantitative work, you could not ask it to even say, now, what percentage of negative representation of mother, for example, or what is the percentage of positive representation of mothers? And when it gives you that response, you could actually even ask the AI and said, could you explain to me how you arrive at these percentages, for instance? And it's going to explain to you, walk you through the steps of how it arrived at that particular percentages. Now, for example, this particular one we have here, the family communal lexical network. Now, you could agree with me if you have read this particular one by Chinua Achebe, you know that this interlocking network mathematically demonstrates how identity in the novel operates simultaneously at individual, family, and community level. And so if you see that the ratio of collective pronouns to family terms, if you do the math, will be like 2.86 of 1.5 the novel's emphasis, which actually showed the emphasis of the novel on communal identity over nuclear family structure. All right. And then if we now let me show us another one, pronoun load and subjectivity. Now here I brought up all the pronouns that were used basically, in the novel. Again, remember what I said. It is almost impossible for you to do this without the aid of technology, right? You cannot get all these numbers without the aid of technology, right? So I brought up all the pronouns that were used. Now let me bring let me just so what I did here was that when we encounter, for example, he, his, him, they, their, them, she, her, you, we, and the rest of them. Now we might be tempted, naturally, you might be tempted to kind of dismiss them as neutral carriers or point of view, right? But in things fall apart, these pronouns do something far more consequential, actually. Now, together, these pronouns together constitute about 21% of the 100 most frequent words in the entire text. And this is not really a trivial activity because Chinua Achebe knew exactly what he was doing. Now, Chinua Achebe uses pronouns to signal a pluralization of subjectivity. Chinua Achebe is simply trying to say that identity here is not singular. It is not fixed. All right. So instead of what we call negotiated inquiry, Achebe was trying to show that across kinship ties, across clan responsibilities, across ancestral memory, and across the ruptures of colonial imposition, this pronoun speaks a lot of different things. For example, every time you see I, every I is already embedded in a we, and every he in a network of them. And so if you begin to look at this West collective, like I said, you could also copy this entire place from the software. And then AI has said, which proper noun, for example, is most associated with different pronouns, for instance. When you provide that response, you begin to wonder, so why is this proper noun most associated with these pronouns? And so what you are doing now is that you are using computer to go extremely deeper into the work. What normally people won't actually do. What normally people won't actually do. Well, of course, we have what we call epistemic silence or absence as epistemic marker. Now, we know that no Western names or locations appear in the top 100 words. So when I run this on the software, it gives me a list of the top 100 words. That's the top 100 words that appear the most in the entire novels. And in the top 100 words, you will never see one single Western name or location that appeared there. You won't see a Western proper noun or any location, right? And so neither do you see missionaries or colonial administrators. Now this is interesting because even though these people dominate the second half of the book, Achebe uses statistical silence, what I call statistical silence, as a political tool. He refused to make the colonial presence semantically central. So even when it is narratively consequential, he decided that, no, I'm not going to make colonial presence semantically or statistically important. He decided to silence them. Now, what I can tell you is this. Is it possible that Achebe thought of this before writing? The answer I can give you authoritatively is no, right? But because his interest, his focus is entirely different, now statistics of the literary work he had done is beginning to reveal even deeper insight from what originally the author might not even been thinking about. I've seen some authors, when their work is subjected to literary quantitative literary analysis, they said, I wasn't actually thinking about this when I was doing this particular research or when I was writing this particular book, right? And that is true. But when scholars now engage in those analyses, they see something entirely different. Okay, so so I decided to show you a picture of, if you look at my feet and see a picture of the software I'm talking about, it's called Anscom. Now, if you look at this place I'm pointing now, you will see it says 1 to 100 of 132 hits. So it means if you look at this place, I have mother. This is where I put the word mother. So I was searching for the word mother, all right? And I have mother here, and when I click start, it ran, and then it shows that in the entire Still Fall Apart, mother was mentioned 132 times, okay? 132 times. And these are the different contexts where mother was mentioned. These were different contexts. Of course, I can decide to enlarge this context just by choosing sort 2R or sort 3R. I can increase number to sort 2 or sort 5 or sort whatever. But this is a different lecture. It's not for this now. I'm just going to show us the scheme that where we are getting all the things we have been talking about before. So you could see the context of mother and how I got that mother. So the mother space, her heart, her breast, her fire is a consistent site of emotional refuge. Everyday subsistence and moral education across the novel, which kind of represent a counter structure to the public patriarchal order. Now you can see that this maternal space caters not just children, but adult men like Okonkwo, who are in exile, who have gone to exile. And after feeling in the fatherland, of course, he had to come back to the motherhood. So there's a way that today presented mothers, as a safe place, as a place where if somebody is having emotional instability or whatever, he can come back to that place and actually have some succor or some kind of realization. Now this is an insight that you may not really be able to see in a very good detail until you're able to do this kind of thing I'm actually showing us now. Now, of course, we have if you, for example, the emotional vocabulary in the novel is overwhelmingly carried through maternal connections. If you stick to look for the word tears, regret, weeping, comfort, kindness, some of those emotional words are connected to motherhood. Many of them are actually connected to motherhood. So Tina Achebe was doing those intentionally. Or even if you're not doing them intentionally, this is now what the insight we're now being able to see. Just from using this kind of tool to see that, wow, so mother is actually, that emotionally charged vocabularies are very much connected to motherhood. Looking at time, so I have to be a little bit faster. Now, if you look at this one now, let me show us this one now. Now, here I want to look at Okonkwo family emotional distance measurement. So how do we actually measure, to know the emotional distance that Okonkwo has with his family? Is it possible? And the answer is yes. Right? The answer is yes. Now, to arrive at the family term adjacency insight, what I did was that I analyzed the provided text fragment from the work of Still Fall Apart, where Okonkwo appears in proximity to family terms. So, for example, I have examples of Okonkwo with family terms where I have like Okonkwo's first son, Woye, was 10, blah, 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 and the rest. And then what I did next was to count the instances where family terms like son, wife, daughter, father, mother, children appeared within 5 words of Okonkwo or Okonkwo's, and found about 47 of such instances. And then the next thing now is that we now began to examine the emotional context of these family references. So whenever Okonkwo appeared in a family context, what are the emotional contexts or what are the emotional references that are adjacent to those discussions? For example, is there positive emotional context? For example, if you read Things Fall Apart, there's a place where he says Okonkwo was specifically fond of Ezima, now which of course shows affection. And you see other places where you have something like Okonkwo's first son, Woye, was then 12 years old, but they did not complain openly. Again, which shows another different kind of emotions entirely. And so these emotions we are compared, and after they are compared, I noticed that of the family references, only a small percentage, about 7%, actually contain positive emotional markers like fun, pleased, or other indicators of warmth or connections. So, in other words, Okonkwo was emotionally distanced from his family. He was emotionally distanced from his family. But guess what? Again, it's something you can only do if you engage with digital tools in engaging in doing your scholarship. Now you can see that his name appeared adjacent to positive emotional terms in only 7 of these instances. Only 7 of these instances. And now that's why you could see that Okonkwo was keeping things a lot to himself, and of course, you know how he eventually, ended. Then Okonkwo diminishing voice, only in the novel before exile and later in the novel after exile during colonial emphasis. Now, during colonial encroachment. Now, the first thing I discovered was that I also checked out to find out, to see how does Okonkwo's voice develop over in the novel, for instance. And I noticed that even in the novel, before his exile, Okonkwo spoke a lot, longer sentences, elongated sentences, but his exile, everything changed. Everything changed. He began to speak in very, very short, sentence. In fact, even the expression that he used, when he eventually, killed the stranger and then committed suicide, was a very short sentence. Then I'm trying to round up because of time. Then let me show us this. So here, what I did here was I call it linguistic and discourse metrics in Nigeria emergency speakers. What I did here was to pull out Tinubu's presidential state of emergency declaration, and then pull out Goodluck's state of emergency declaration, and then get both to ChatGPT, and then ask ChatGPT and said, hey, these are both state of mind. No, first thing I said, can you explain to me what is happening in these two texts? And then he explained, of course, he was correct and say, there are 2 presidents here, one as so time, one as so time, they declare state of emergency, blah, 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 right? And again, depending on what you are looking for, I think the generic statement I said, can you provide a statistical description analysis of this particular presidential speeches, comparing both Goodluck Jonathan and Tinubu's presidential speech, putting your reference form of a table, having the colon, metric category, Goodluck Jonathan, Tinubu, and then interpretive insights. So I gave it those headers you are seeing there, because one thing in prompt engineering is that if you don't know how to guide the AI to produce a response, it produces bullshit. So the more you're able to guide the AI, the better it produces a stronger response. And then, of course, it started by mentioning the total number of words. Goodluck was very shorter amount of words compared to Tinubu's number of words. And then it talks about, I won't talk about the ATR for now. And then it goes straight to use of legal constitutional references. Goodluck mentioned it about just 3 times. Tinubu mentioned it about 12 times. Then name entity recognition. Goodluck mentioned Boko Haram, militant, governor. Goodluck mentioned Boko Haram, sorry, only. Whereas Tinubu mentioned governor, militant, despot, cohort, and the rest of them. But towards the end, in this place, for example, in this place and in this place, negative evaluatives, ignore collapses, despot, blah, 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 and the rest of them. Now, if you read this thing from beginning to the, if you sit down and read this thing from beginning to the end, you will notice something. I'll summarize this looking at this pronoun usage frequency. For example, Goodluck, for example, uses I 8 times. Tinubu uses I 18 times. Good luck used we 5 times, Tinubu used we 3 times. Good luck used they 4 times, Tinubu used they 15 times. Now, look at the inside. Tinubu shifts from shared leadership to presidential dominance versus adversaries. Now, in summary, what this ChatGPT is simply saying, this analysis simply saying is that the decision that was made about Rivers State's state of emergency by the Tinubu administration tend to be more personal as opposed to Goodluck's own, who tends to be more generic in defense. And that Tinubu decision tend to be more adversarial, whereas Goodluck's own does not tend to be adversarial. Again, now this is not me talking, for example, right? And that's one thing that using tools like this can help you do. It kills your subjective notion about whether you are politically biased or whatever, and just allow the tool, the system, to speak from the data that it sees. Now, is it able to arrive at this kind of inferences or interpretative insight? It's using, remember what I talked about sentiment analysis, it's using all those algorithmic logic to be able to arrive at these responses. I'm trying to make sure that I don't have any question. Someone said, what ChatGPT that created the table? I was bounced out for a while, so I missed some part. Yes, ChatGPT that created this particular table I'm showing you right now. And by the way, for some of you who don't, of course, don't need to subscribe for ChatGPT Premium, you can actually subscribe. You can actually use DeepSeek, deepseek.com. You can actually use DeepSeek, which allow you to also have the same experience you could have with ChatGPT Premium. Right? I'm just typing it on the group now. DeepSeek.com. That's the Chinese equivalent of ChatGPT. So I saw a hand raised. Okay, go ahead. Taiwo.
Yes,
Go ahead.
thank you. Although I've written my question on the page anyway, but because you also mentioned DeepSeek, I will just take everything together. I've been using DeepSeek. I've been using ChatGPT. I observe that at times I use both for some things and they bring out powerful responses. But how do I clean up my data what that I use that I generate through AI, so that it will not say that this is AI generated or AI generated and refined? Thank you. Like what you just showed us now is powerful, but some of this content you used some other means to generate them. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So how do you clean up your data? Now that has to do with that's a big question in what we call an agency and AI authorship. Who owns what AI produces? You actually own it. Whatever you submit, you have to own it. Now, when AI gives you a response, we anticipate that you are an expert in that area, in quote. And so you have to look at the response it gives you and say, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. You have to make sure that whatever you eventually take and submit, it means that you vetted it, that this is me now talking to you. So we don't care whether it's AI that wrote it. The course I'm teaching here, for example, many professors were scared initially, they were banning AI. I told my students, hey, you can use AI whichever way you want to use AI. Now I gotta know how to use AI. But I said, see, if you're not intelligent, you cannot get something intelligent from AI. It's as simple as that. And guess what? The student performance was exactly the same thing as it was before even AI came. There was no difference. It was exactly the same thing. Probably the students that got the same A were same students that got the same A, even though many of them were not using ChatGPT. So how you make it your own is by looking at the resources it gives you and saying, no, this doesn't make sense. This makes sense. But wait, I want to collapse this into this. I want to collapse this into this. For example, the table that he gave me, for example, I can collapse that entire table into just about 6 different teams, only 6 teams. As a matter of fact, you can even tell it to collapse the table into 6 major teams and ask it to justify the reason for such collapsing. Now, for you to ask that question means you are intelligent. You have gone beyond a normal average user of ChatGPT, not ask that kind of question, for example. So again, if you are very creative and intelligent, the intelligent question you're asking the system is what will make your response very unique. ChatGPT, for example, now has ChatGPT deep research, for example, which can generate 8,000 or 6,000 words, which is like full paper, for instance, right? But for the full paper won't make any marginally quality sense per se. but it's a foundation that somebody can now look and say, okay, let me start looking at this and this and this and that. So you have to really put in your voice there. But the most important thing is, what kind of question are you asking the system? That is what will determine the uniqueness of your response. When ChatGPT, and people were saying that they have GPT-0, which helps identify AI writing. I told them, you cannot identify my writing, and they doubted it, the professors. And I was, before them, I wrote a prompt, generated a response, gave it to GPT. It said this is purely 100% human generated. And they were amazed. I told them the reason why I cannot detect it is because I'm a prompt engineer. So the prompt I gave the AI to generate the response was almost about 2 pages. I write an extremely detailed prompt that is almost difficult to mimic. So when the AI produces a response, it's producing something that is massively and marginally unique. It's not a generic response. Can you tell me about this, or write about this, or write about this? No, it was a very detailed response that has the context, tell me the format, provided example, output format, gave it reference, and very detailed prompt. And so that way, it produces something that's quite very unique compared to what every other person actually gets. So no, I'll leave this one because of time. So like prompt engineering, I've already started mentioning about prompt engineering. There are 5 major prompting principles that you must bear in mind: clarity, specificity. If you are asking AI anything, I beg you, if you know the way you are sending email to a professor, you don't just allow typos in your email. Don't allow typos in your prompting when you're typing. I don't say, no, it will correct it. It will correct it, but guess what? It reduces the quality of the response. That's what some people don't know. The quality of the response. All right. The time it takes the system to go and correct that particular thing you wrote diverts the system attention from thinking it means something else. Because for every typo you write, there's a potential for it to mean something else. And we're still trying to think about what does it mean, and then correcting it to align with what you said, looking at the sentence structure, it diverts the system's attention to actually producing a stronger response. So you have to be very clear. You have to make sure your sentences are correct. Context provision, you can provide context. The formula I normally give people in prompting is this: whenever I ask an AI something, have these particular 3 things in mind. Just basic. There are many more, but just basic. Number 1, role. What role do you want the AI to assume? Is he a professor of history? Is he a this role? Is he that role, or whatever? Number 2, context. What are you talking about? So the role, for example, professor of history, context. I'm giving a presentation about ABC, about history, or blah, 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 blah. Then the next one is, so we have role, context, and next one is task. So task, what do you want AI to do with the context and taking the role that you have assigned to it? Now, what you give AI, now this is how I code in Python as well, by the way. Now, this is how language works at the back end. All right. So the system works with what we call conditional statement. What if, or if this, then this, if this and this, then this. So when you have those kind of clarity, if I look at, okay, this is cool now. So I'm not going to provide this response with a generic AI model. I have to provide this response thinking in quotes like a professor of history, for example, or a scholar of history. And then with my understanding of this context, now let me perform this now. So it's going to provide a more tailored specific response compared to the generic one that everybody normally sees. Then the composition, constraint specification, and the rest. So I said here that the quality of an AI response is only as good as the prompt it receives. If your prompt is bad, the response is going to be bad. So I have very few prompting here. I said you can start the title of the work. Consider how the narrative handles memory that resists formal attack. I'll send this to you, but I gave very few prompting here. Anyway, by the end of this year, my book on prompt engineering for academic writing is going to be out, and I will donate some e-copies I'll give some e-copy licenses to research rounds so they could share with all the participants that were part of this particular program. So it's about 200 pages book, that detailed prompting for academic writing in covering different areas and different kind of simulations and the rest that you could use. So for example, now just talk about this last one. For example, in a live dialogue contribution in a novels by Chimamanda Adichie, Noviola Bolayo, and this Pisa. What percentage of female character dialogue receive verbal descriptors beyond paid? Compare this with male character dialogue and assess implication for gender representation. Now, this is something that it might take you a long period of time for you to be able to do this manually. But with AI and software like Answers and the rest of them, you can actually do this within, depending on how fast you are and how, the level of engagement you have with those material tests, can determine within a 2, 3 days, 5 days, 1 week, you can actually produce a very strong paper that revolve around this particular thing I just discussed here. So I have some links here, but I'm still going to send a lot more to the team. Yeah. So we've come to the end of the day, but I'm open to taking more questions as we round off now.
Please show the links again, please. Can you please show the links again?
I'm sending it to the team, so you have the entire slide. Don't worry about it. You're going to have the entire slide.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. So in the absence of any other question, I want to say thank you very much for for taking time to be in this session. You could connect with me on LinkedIn. My name is same name on LinkedIn, Frank Onuh. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very much active on LinkedIn, more than I am even in email. So you can connect with me on LinkedIn, and you are free to ask questions, and definitely I will provide us whenever I'm online, and we could take it. I'm always happy to help as much as I could in the area of artificial intelligence and general area that I just discussed in general here. Basically, I'm broadly within the area of AI bias, AI ethics, and just like that. But my foundation in English also gave me a very strong footing, to do what you see me do now. And I'm able to do that simply because I decided to stay put with integrating technology in every aspect of my research, which I'll marginally encourage us. If you begin to do that, you are looking for maybe say funding or fellowship, outside Nigeria, it's very, very much easier for you to actually get that. Because one thing that technology helps us to do is that it tells people that we can try to replicate your research and find out whether you lied or not. All right. So which is what is done in sciences actually. All right. So if everything I presented about Tino Achebe here now, if you try to do it, you can get exactly the same result actually. It can't lie. So that's what science is about. And so you are trying to now make your work as a humanities scholar to begin to be more scientific in quotes, as it is in the science discipline. And that way you see more avenues to collaborate with other people outside your own discipline. So finally, Otsai Onyechi has a question, and that will be the last question for the day. Otsai Onyechi, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I listened to the presentation, but then at a point I got lost somewhere. My question now is, can you give me an example of how we can use this for social sciences research? Because I know I've heard of somebody using this to sentiment to do somebody did sentiment analysis on reviews from chat was Airbnb. So I want to like have other ideas on how we can actually use get data for sentiment analysis. And also I really want to remind you about the codes for the text mining you said you were going to send to us if we are interested. Thank you.
So, all right. So for the code, I'll add the code. I'll add the link. I have it on GitHub actually. So for some of us who might not be able to navigate GitHub, I'll add it on a Google Drive link, and then add it on link I'm going to share there. So once you click on the link, you can copy the code. But I would advise you, if you delete even a comma from the code will not run. So you have to be extremely careful, make sure you don't delete anything at all from the code. Don't delete anything at all from the code. Now for sentiment analysis, now that you mentioned it also, I also add a link to some free sentiment analysis tools that you can download. And they work offline. Once you download them, they work offline. You don't need to be online for them to work. And when you upload a particular set of data sets on it, automatically begins to give you the sentiments of those data. Now, depending on how you set it, if you want it to give sentiment by paragraph or by sentences, you can delimit what you want it to do. And it can begin to give you those, those insights from them. Another option is if you have the data again, you could also use AI, like I said, to do sentiment analysis using those software, for example. And you can actually even compare both of them. You see, when you use a software to do sentiment analysis and use AI, is there a difference? And that will actually be an entirely different paper on its own. All right, how AI tools like ChatGPT, for example, and how already designed softwares do sentiment analysis, and why are they different? Which one do you take and which one do you not take? So one thing you will notice is when you begin to engage in this way with these materials, you will begin to, you won't be tired of publishing because you keep seeing new things. Ideas will just keep popping your head. All right, ideas will just keep coming to you, and then you can just keep it going that way. I don't know if that helps. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, like I said. So please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and then ask questions. You can also send me an email, and then we could just take it off from there. So thank you guys very much. I don't take this for granted. Every opportunity I have to share with people, with my colleagues, I don't take it for granted. Thank you for staying awake this late and being part of this particular program. Thank you so very much. And I wish you all the best and all the luck in your programs. You guys are going to do amazing things. Honestly, you guys are going to do amazing. Trust me. Don't belittle what you already know. You just need a little push to get there. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you, sir. Have a
Thank
good
you,
day.
Frank. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of